Testing microphone 1 2 1 2 test 1 2 3 4. Checking microphone 1 2 1 2. Check microphone testing 1 2 3. Testing microphone. Nothing. Testing 1 2 testing 1 2 3 4. Testing microphone 1 2 3 4. Test. Testing 1 2 3 4. Testing microphone 1 2 3 4. Better now? Okay.
There you go. The subcommittee will resume its sitting, and Dr. Yang, I know you do have to go to the funeral of your brother-in-law, and again, my greatest sympathies to you and your family, but please.
Yep, I have a few further points to make, then I can leave. Yep. Mr. Chairman, Liu Xiaobo represents the best of what China can be in death as well as in life. He possesses a moral authority that his persecutors can only envy. His legacy of love, justice, and courage will surely far outlive the deeds of those who persecuted him. Liu Xiaobo was a major leader of the 1989 democracy movement. He shouldered moral and political responsibility after Tiananmen Square, continued to fight inside China for its constitutional democracy while many left the country and even left the movement. He shared the suffering of his compatriots and made great sacrifices for them. He is a saint. His spirit will be uplifting and unifying force that will inspire more people of China to fight to realize his dream, indeed, the common dream of Chinese people. To the world, he represents the universal values that all democracy embrace and the unwavering struggle of unfree people for freedom. Liu Xiaobo is a representative of ideas that resonate with millions of people all over the world. But it is a sad and disturbing fact that many leaders of the free world, who themselves hold democracy and human rights in high regard, have been less willing to stand up for those rights for the benefits of others. If this became a widely accepted fashion and continued, the democratic way and the security of the free people would eventually in jeopardy. Today, I cannot help asking, what kind of a government would refuse to grant the final wish of such a peaceful, kind man as Liu Xiaobo, a man who sincerely believes that he has no enemies, to die as a free man, to die with dignity? What kind of a government would not even allow him the last moment of being with his beloved wife without surveillance? This is a totally morally bankrupted regime. Dealing with such a regime, one must have a moral clarity. There are a lot of talking about engaging with China. Yes, no one can avoid engaging with China, but democracies must engage China comprehensively. Democracies must engage this brutal face of this regime and must not look the other way when human rights tragedies take place. The Chinese government can never be considered a true trusted peer on the global stage until they address their egregious human rights violations. The tragic passing of Liu Xiaobo gave us a stronger sense of urgency to help other dissidents. I'm afraid that more human rights activists will languish and disappear in China's prisons. Wang Bingzhang, Hu Shigen, Zhu Yufu, Ilham Tohti, Tashi Wangqiu, Wang Quanzhang, Jiang Tianyong, Tian Jingling, Wu Gan, Guo Feixiong, Liu Xianbing, Chen Wei, Zhang Haitao. The list can go on and on. If American advocacy for human rights and justice is to mean anything at all, the US government must do more to support these political prisoners and to hold accountable the government and individuals who so brazenly abuse their fundamental rights. We all hoped that Liu Xiaobo would one day complete his unjust prison sentence and then have more time to share his passion and energy for human rights and dignity. And also perhaps one day to have time to enjoy for himself the fruits of freedom. But instead, he is gone. To close, I want to share with you the beautiful words of Martin Luther King Jr., which he delivered in a speech in Memphis, Tennessee, on the evening before his own death. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We have got some difficult days ahead, but it really does not matter with me now, because I have been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He has allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I have looked over, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land.
Leon, again, thank you for your passion and precision in how you present. It couldn't be clearer, the stark difference between the gross evil of what is done by the leadership of the PRC and a man of light of Liu Xiaobo's character. So thank you for all three of you, thank you for bearing witness to the noble truth of this man and what he stood for. I note again in Dr. Yang, in your testimony, you pointed out that the denial of Medicare led to Liu Xiaobo's advanced liver cancer, and it was at its core a disguised death sentence. To not treat, certainly no early detection, and as you point out in your testimony, as far back as 2010, Liu Xiaobo was suspected of suffering from hepatitis B. His lawyers, and Mr. Gensler, you spoke about this many times, petitioned the government and kept asking to grant him a medical parole to get the health care, the health attention that he needed, rather than languishing in a horrific jail cell. I think the other story that needs to be told by the media globally is this whole death sentence. It wasn't like he got Johns Hopkins-like medical care or Sloan Kettering grade medical care. He was ignored. The evidence clearly suggests that they did nothing or very little. And to deny his request to go to Germany or to here to get the kind of care he needs, and to turn that down shows a barbarity that just needs to be confronted aggressively. And like I said earlier, I think this needs to be the pivot to human rights in his legacy, of course, but because there are so many others who are still suffering horribly in the Laogai and throughout China's concentration camp system. And when Xi Jinping goes to Davos, talks about transparency and openness, it's a cruel joke. I am glad that the administration did put China on tier 3 for its egregious abuses with regards to sex and labor trafficking. Magnitsky needs to be fully and full-throttled in its implementation to hold individuals to account. The International Religious Freedom Act, which has China as a country of particular concern, or CPC country, carries with it at least 18 prescribed sanctions that can be very, very potent if utilized. They have not been. So my hope is that will also be, there has to be a response to this. the likes of which we've never seen before. As you said so eloquently, Dr. Yang, a disguised death sentence. For what? For peacefully asking for fundamental freedoms and human rights. So if any of you would like to comment on this lack of medical attention, which is appalling, please do. And I do have some other questions, but any other points you would like to make as well, we would like to receive.
Mr. Chairman, I have to leave right now. Yeah.
Well, I do want to build on Global Magnitsky, and my view is, and I will work on this myself, is I'd like to put together a comprehensive list of everybody who was responsible for Liu Xiaobo's arrest, trial, imprisonment, and care or lack thereof, from the prosecutor to the judge to the person who ran his prison to the hospital where he died. It seems to me that we could put together a list of 12 or 15 names of people that are directly responsible for what happened to him, and that should be among a number of different things that are done to send a very clear message about where the United States stands in regards to those who are actually responsible. There will be no justice and accountability, of course, for anybody in China, but there needs to be some measure of justice and accountability for Liu Xiaobo as part of his legacy, and to send a very clear signal about there being consequences to decisions that are being made at all levels of government in China. So that's what I would just have to say on Global Magnitsky.
It's worth noting, I think, that the pattern of having political prisoners die in prison in China is a pattern. It's not just that Liu Xiaobo was the first one. A few years ago, a woman named Cao Shunli, who's not nearly as famous as he is, was ground to death. She disappeared in about September 15th on her way to go to Geneva for a report on human rights in China. The police took her into prison, and she was released 6 months later in a coma, given to her family after it was clear that she would not live, but not wanting her to die in prison because the regime is afraid of that black eye on its record. I would like to make another point, though, as we remember this man. I think it's important that we, and by we I mean the whole world, recognize him as a world-class person, not just a China person. I mean, we China scholars have the problem, I think, of thinking that he speaks for China and he's talking about Chinese human rights and we're dealing with the Chinese government, and all of that is true. But he speaks to the whole world. In my statement a moment ago, I referred to Mandela and Havel and Aung San Suu Kyi, all of whom are viewed as world-class upholders of freedom and human rights, and he should be too. I noticed on the PBS TV program that announced his death last night, I was waiting to see which China scholar would come on and talk about it, but they didn't have a China scholar. They had a man from India who represented Amnesty International, and I thought that was wonderful because the point is he speaks for all of humanity, not just Chinese humanity. And in that connection, I think it's good that this subcommittee is on Africa, global health, global human rights, and international organizations. That's a very good step toward saying what Liu Xiaobo stood for is universal human rights, not just China.
Ask you, Dr. Link, you've testified before, and I appreciate your testimony you've provided us on the whole university, the 12 campuses of, like NYU, for example, Kane College, in China, on mainland China, and then all the Confucius centers.
Yes.
Has there been any response over the last 2 weeks? And we passed a resolution. I authored it. It was co-sponsored by Pelosi, so it's totally and absolutely bipartisan, and it passed unanimously in the House 2 weeks ago, calling for Liu Xiaobo and his wife and family to be able to come here or wherever they'd like to go for medical treatment. Have we heard anything on those campuses or at the Confucius centers about the life and the tremendous legacy and the work of Liu Xiaobo?
The Confucius Centers are on living, breathing U.S. campuses, and so it's certain that some people on those campuses notice these things and support them. I haven't done a survey of what the Confucius Institute's leaders themselves have done, but I feel very confident in saying that no, they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. They get money from the Hanban in China, and without its being in written form, know that there are certain things you just don't do. You don't entertain the Dalai Lama or Liu Xiaobo or the Falun Gong problem or Tibet or Xinjiang or the Beijing massacre. There's a list of about 24 utterly untouchable topics that Confucius Institutes just don't observe.
My hope is, and we will, as the China Commission, which I also co-chair with Marco Rubio, I think it would be very timely for us to write them and ask them to raise the issue of Liu Xiaobo's widow, Xia, as a NYU Shanghai campus, and I did speak there a year ago, a little over a year ago, on human rights. And of course, Liu Xiaobo was one of the first things I said there. But they have, I think, an obligation, I would say a moral duty to speak out, because they tell us that they have academic freedom and the ability to speak in an unfettered way. And you're right, there are economic interests intertwined, but the hope would be that America's voice, and I would say not just America, a universally important, universally recognized human rights voice needs to be articulated now. There needs to be a pivot to human rights. The old days have to be over of just thinking that backdoor diplomacy and mentioning it, under your breath is going to work. It's not going to work. It has not worked. We had a number of women testify here before our committee just recently, all the wives of human rights lawyers who have been detained pursuant to that crackdown by Liu Xiaobo, by Xi Jinping, and to hear them tell their stories about, their husbands are just, and because they suffer equally. The idealism is just breathtaking, and yet they're in prison. Same way with the 5 daughters hearing that we had of all of those young Chinese daughters who couldn't even get a meeting with President Obama, and they pleaded with us to tell him, please let us talk to him face to face. He has 2 daughters. He'll understand. They never got the meeting. And they were articulate, and they were daughters that just spoke out so articulately and bravely on behalf of their dads who are suffering, like Gao Zhejiang and others. I think that's something we need to do, is to get at least these U.S. universities, which should or used to be beacons of academic freedom and human rights and inquiry, to raise the issue of Liu Xiaobo's widow and the work and legacy of Liu Xiaobo himself and Charter 08, the great manifesto.
I think it's a brilliant idea to have you or others in the Congress write to all of the American campuses, especially the prestigious ones who've accepted Confucius Institutes, first asking the question, saying a Nobel Peace Prize winner has died in police custody in China. Surely this is a topic worth note. What has your institute done about it? And then go on to ask the question, what are your plans for helping the wife?
Thank you, Dr. Link. Mr. Garrett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this meeting, and my apologies candidly to our guest. The timing is not the best, but obviously it coincides with this tragic loss of the life of a vocal leader for human rights around the world. It strikes me that the balance that the United States maintains with China is an interesting one, that we might be, to a greater extent than perhaps in any era in recent history, rivals, and yet we're arguably codependent upon one another economically and globally. The paramount interest of our office, and I think my constituents based on my listening, is that there would be peace and stability and that there would be a fundamental right to an opportunity extended to people in the 5th District of Virginia, the United States, and candidly globally. And so, and pardon me if I don't do service to Lo Xiaobo's name, but when a person of this magnitude exercises the moral courage which we've witnessed in this country through the statements and actions of people like Patrick Henry and Martin Luther King, Barbara Johns and Abraham Lincoln, it is indeed, as you say, something that should be taken note of by the world. While folks of my political ilk might sometimes find fault with some of the selections of the Nobel Committee, I think they could have found no more appropriate recipient than Lo Xiaobo. And one of the things that I've crusaded for as a member of the State House and now the Congress is a greater awareness by Americans of who Barbara Johns was. It was a 16-year-old girl who led a student walkout in Farmville, Virginia in the early 1950s, which really sparked the civil rights movement in Virginia, and did so at the imperilment of her own life and that of others, and did so at a time when, at a similar age, I was concerned with poppin' zits and whether or not I could get a prom date. And so sometimes I wonder what we do well here, what we can accomplish here. But to this end, I would say, Congressman Smith, gentlemen, folks in the room, that the more people we can get to go to Google and type in Lo Xiaobo's name and understand what he did in the face of the odds in which he did it, the more Lo Xiaobos there will be. I guess to the extent that we can help, I commend you on raising awareness and teaching about folks who we might not agree with on every single piece of subject matter, but who stand for fundamental truths that no one who is an American can deny, and that is that all people are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain rights. And so I suppose I'll take my time here to query both of you what, again, within the purview of the legislative branch of the United States federal government, we can do to ensure that his legacy doesn't die with his physical body, to insist that an important trade partner and member of the world community, China, understands that we give a damn, pardon me, and to encourage greater freedom and opportunity across the globe, and do so wherever practicable and possible without bombs and bullets and missiles and rockets, but brave men and women who are willing to stand up in the face of potential imprisonment or worse. So I'd offer first Mr. Genser the floor for suggestions. What can we do within the purview of Article 1 to help perpetuate the legacy of this great leader, to convey to our Chinese partners that we care, that we will not sit by idly as members of, say, for example, the Falun Gong are imprisoned on the eve of what was supposed to be a meeting with U.S. leadership. What can we do to abate my fear that when spouses of imprisoned dissidents show up before this committee, they've only made their family's circumstance worse?
Well, thanks, Congressman Garrett, for your remarks, with which I fully agree, and your commitment to human rights as well. Let me just mention a couple of things that I think are important that the Congress could be particularly involved in helping. The first, of course, and most importantly, is to help get Liu Xia and her brother out of China as rapidly as possible. We need to restore access to them and then confirm their wishes and get them out. And that should be a top priority. And I think that pressure by having this hearing today, pressure by moving a bill that's focused on Liu Xia and her brother. We've also been talking about a private member's bill that would give them legal permanent resident status immediately upon arriving in the United States. These are things Congress can do. So that would be number one. Number two, Liu Xiaobo Plaza. Renaming the street in front of the Chinese embassy for Liu Xiaobo, I think, is a way that the United States and governments all over the world, and I'm sure we'll be campaigning for this for all countries in the world, to rename the streets in front of the Chinese embassy Liu Xiaobo Plaza. This is something that obviously has to go through the Congress and then go to the president for signature. Number 3, justice and accountability, and I was just mentioning as well, having a list of those responsible for Liu Xiaobo and Liu Sha's deaths, to have the Congress advocating, to have them sanctioned under global Magnitsky, and to make clear that this is why they're being sanctioned. And then let me just step back broadly and make a final point, which is something that I've spent my career as a human rights lawyer fighting for the freedom of prisoners of conscience. I spent 5 years as Aung San Suu Kyi's International Counsel. I've represented more than 40 prisoners of conscience over my career and founded Freedom Now, my NGO, on whose board I sit, which has a full-time staff in Washington and London to work on these cases. One of the things I think the U.S. needs to do more directly, and I think the Congress could play a key role in a legislative context, is to focus our foreign policy on the world's prisoners of conscience, right? Because it seems to me that, we have annual human rights reports, and that's really good, and prisoners of conscience are kind of a narrow piece of it, but a more focused set of activities for the United States to focus on prisoners of conscience, because what we have found historically, and we were talking about a lot of different, obviously names, people like Havel, people like Mandela, is that the prisoners of conscience of today are the leaders of their countries tomorrow, and that for the United States to stand in solidarity with homegrown pro-democracy activists, not the United States imposing our values or our form of government onto others, but embracing those that within their own countries see the value of democracy, the value of human freedom, and to systematically, as part of our foreign policy and engaging with every country in the world, any country that is persecuting prisoners of conscience, our engagement with that country, not just from the State Department or the National Security Council, but from every agency, can be focused on a list of names that would be raised, focused on training foreign service officers to do these kinds of things, focused on reporting requirements for the State Department about what's being done to help these people. What's interesting is that if you look at the case of Natan Sharansky, who of course was a Soviet dissident whose wife Avital met with President Reagan. A mentor of mine in my career, Erwin Kotler, was his counsel, and had a chance to talk to Gorbachev about why did you release Natan Sharansky. And what Gorbachev said was really telling, and I think really, really important, which was to say that, well, I didn't know who this guy, Natan Sharansky, was until and many years before he became the president of the Soviet Union. He was an agricultural minister of agriculture, and he came to the United States on some kind of agricultural exchange and discussion about, well, agricultural issues. And yet, on the U.S. side, our agriculture secretary raised to him Natan Sharansky's name in a meeting about agriculture. And one of the first things he did when he became president, he told my friend and mentor Erwin Kotler, was to ask the secret police, the KGB, for the file of Natan Sharansky, because he had heard about this in many meetings with U.S. government officials over and over and over again, and like, why is the agricultural secretary doing this? And he looked at the file and he's like, well, this makes no sense. Why is this guy in jail? And ultimately he was released. And so, to me, that's an important lesson for the United States, that prisoners of conscience and helping people of this sort isn't just the responsibility of some narrow assistant secretary for democracy, labor, and human rights to be raising, but that it has to be part and parcel and central to U.S. foreign policy as a strategic tactic to be regularly deployed to try to advance human freedom around the world. So let me conclude.
So to some degree, the Sharansky case was almost a ye have not because ye ask not. The attention was all it was. One thing that I was probably unintelligently voiced my frustration with, and I've only been here for a short time, is that I don't feel that we have synergy between the executive and the legislative as it relates to working together. I don't feel, sometimes I feel, and we've worked on the release of some prisoners of conscience, particularly in the southern Nuba Mountain regions of the Republic of the Sudan, and I almost feel like State Department wants to know why I care. God bless the good men and women there. I don't want to, but I mean, we should be working together to advance the same goals, and wherever any human being is held prisoner based on beliefs, unless those beliefs advocate violence against other humans, why can't we all agree on that, right? So thank you immensely, and I would love to speak to you briefly after the hearing about what you do, because I think we might be able to help to the same, I think, admirable goal. The only thing that I've been able to do in 6 months here that I can take pride in and take to my grave is help affect the release of individuals held because of their beliefs, right? It's hard to pass a bill, but when you tell somebody the United States of America is looking and cares about some formerly nameless individual in prison because of their faith or their actions of humanity towards another, and something happens, then you go, maybe this is all worth it. Thanks for what you do. Dr. Link, what else, within the context of the legislative role of, the Article 1 constitutional underpinnings of this body, should we be doing that we're not doing? And by the way, I texted my legislative director during your comments to get us on the bill that is out there as it relates to the plaza. I just... Xiaobo Plaza. I'm wholly cognizant of my inability to properly pronounce certain things.
Let me add my voice to the chorus that says that the Xiaobo Plaza is a great idea. I really strongly endorse that. And also endorse what my colleague Jared Genzer said in some more detail about focus of foreign policy on prisoners of conscience. I think it's often perceived that we do that because it makes us feel better, and that's good. We should feel better. It's right to do the right thing, and we're better people for doing it. But what he's pointed out is that it's also an investment in practical terms in a better world, because these people that we're helping emerge, Havel did, Mandela did, Aung San Suu Kyi did, Liu Xiaobo can't, but there are more. It's a good investment from a practical point of view. I would add a third, which Jared sort of mentioned, but I would put it this way, and that's the bully pulpit is a good thing to use. It sounds like we're just pontificating, preaching, and so on, and that there might be backlash. But I think that's not right. Even the leaders, even the oppressors in China at another level know that democracy and human rights are a good thing. Watch the way they put the word democracy in their own rhetoric. Stalin, Lenin said they had democratic centralism. Mao Zedong said it was democratic centralism. North Korea, the most repugnant state on the face of the globe today, calls itself the Democratic Republic. There is a two-leveledness in the psychology of the oppressors. They want it both ways. Underneath, on the surface, the West is bad, the West's values are not universal, and they're oppressing us and so on, but I'm going to send my daughter to Harvard. Xi Jinping's daughter went there. Send them money. I'm from California. The Los Angeles area is full of communities that are built on money, probably corrupt money, shipped from China, that the privileged elite in China wants to ship abroad. They send their kids to go to U.S. schools more and more and more. So what does this say? Does this say that they hate Western values? No. It's a rivalrous feeling, and at one level they say we're all against you, but at another level, we're sending our children and our money to your country for safekeeping. So that gives us a platform on which to say, without apology, democracy, freedom, human rights are good things. And they may say on the surface, no, that's Western imperialism. Underneath, they know it's not. A lot of them know it's not. Therefore, I think what I've just called the bully pulpit, when our officials go to the G20 meetings, and when they go to the United Nations, or through VOA and Radio Free Asia, don't be embarrassed to put our values out there. There's more to them than the tyrants in China want to admit.
Thank you, Dr. Link. I would beg the chairman's indulgence for another question that's tangentially related and not directly related, but your comments have got the wheels turning a little bit. There is some call from various sectors to, in order to exert pressure on the Chinese, to exert pressure on North Korea, consider rolling back admissions of Chinese students to U.S. universities. My immediate reaction is that we don't have a Sisi in Egypt if there's not a period of learning and experiencing American culture, that we don't have any number of leaders abroad who've turned out to be pretty good allies if they hadn't spent time here in the United States. So there's back-end value to having the children, even of the Chinese ruling class, in American institutions. Right. Having said that, the secondary argument is, you know, there is a rivalry, there is a need for engineers and software developers and expertise, and there is a competitive nature to it, whether we like it or not. And institutions are producing the young women and men who are beating us at our own game, if you will. I would love your opinion on the idea that somehow denying access to our universities might advance goals as it relates to human rights and stability and safety on the Korean Peninsula, and as it relates to geopolitical stability and security, which might manifest itself differently based on the regions from which our excellent young students might matriculate. And this is an opinion question. There are no wrong answers.
As a broad principle, I would say that it's good for us to take the children of anybody, if they're smart enough to get through the universities and do well, and that the long-range effects of a U.S. education on the children of the Chinese elite is a good thing, and I work in a university. I make certain exceptions for that, though. About a week ago, a Wall Street Journal columnist named Bill McGurn called me up, and he asked me what I thought of targeting the offspring of the super elite in China and denying them visas to come to Harvard and Stanford and Chicago as a method of getting leverage for China to cooperate on North Korea. And I said, I think that's a good idea. So there's an exception there to my broader principle. And I would just say I make that exception because it's well known that we have no good options on North Korea. You know, if you bomb an attack, that's going to wreak havoc. It's going to destroy the city of Seoul. If you just do what we've done for the last 3 decades, which is to cross your fingers and hope for the best, that's not working either. What can we do? China, of course, can play a key role. That would be the way to really bring pressure on the North Korean regime. But China won't. I think the Chinese leadership likes their position of being able to waffle and have us constantly begging them to help, and they say they will, but then they don't, and so on. That's their end game. They like that. So when Bill McGurn asked me, is this a way to get the top leaders' attention in a very personal way, I said yes, and I would make that exception. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't want to, Mr. Genser, if you have any comments to that end, I'd welcome them. I don't want to freeze you out here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Perry on this. I think as a strategic question overall, I think the more that we can expose foreigners to U.S. universities, the more that our system of government, the system, the free market, our values will be transmitted. But you know, you look at certain countries in the world who send their leaders send their kids to the United States, and you may have a different take on it. So, for example, let's take Iran, right? You know, it was reported in the media about a year and a half ago that the woman who was actually the spokesperson for the students who took the U.S. Embassy in '79, Masuma Ebtekar, who was referred to as Mary back then as the spokeswoman, her son is getting his PhD in California, and she is the sitting vice president of Iran and the head of their EPA, and has been an unrepentant person with respect to everything relating to the United States, and including her role in taking American hostages. Do I think it's a good idea to allow someone like that to have their child educated in the United States? Not really. My view is that while ordinarily I would never want to punish a child for the sins of their father or mother, in a case like that, where the person is a sitting senior leader and is an unrepentant hostage taker, I don't think that we should be opening up our borders freely to people like that. And I would note as well that among my other clients are Siamak and Bakir Namazi, 2 American citizen hostages in Iran, 2 of 4 currently. And so Iran isn't just historically having taken hostages, but it is doing so today, and the current government of Iran, and in particularly the Revolutionary Guard Corps, are responsible for that. So it does seem to me that, that one needs to be smart about this and not just go with a big hammer and say, well, let's just not let people in. But I think that strategically the United States can definitely use access to our university system to send targeted messages in the right way and in the right time.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'll wrap up. So in conclusion, I would ask the yes or no question. The succinct summary of what you said is, if we target specific individuals and paint with a very narrow brush, that there can be an effective outcome. If we paint with a broad brush and essentially say we're not going to have students from country X, it's probably deleterious to our long-term desires.
Correct.
Yes.
Thank you guys immensely. And again, Mr. Genser, if you'll stick around for a little bit, I'd be grateful.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garrett. And I'll just conclude and ask if you have any final statements that you would like to make before we end the hearing. Just for the record, Senator Cruz's bill to rename International Drive Leo Xiaobo's Plaza has been hotlined in the Senate. Unfortunately, it has a couple of holds on it, and that is the way the Senate works. One member can hold up a bill, but it is being actively pursued there. And Mark Meadows, a member of our subcommittee, has introduced H.R. 2537 to rename Leo Xiaobo Plaza. And our hope is as soon as that can get approved, the better. And I'm very proud to be one of the co-sponsors following his lead on that. Just one brief point, about a whole of government approach. We recently enacted the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, and one of the main parts of that legislation was to have a whole of government approach so that you don't get a human rights dialogue that becomes an end unto a means unto an end, where it's like a cul-de-sac. Everyone talks, everybody leaves. There's no connection to anything else. We need the U.S. trade representative. We need people in the military, particularly when there's a government-to-government contact of some kind, to almost like, as you pointed out with the Ag Secretary and Natan Sharansky, or Ag officials, that they realize that every time they turn around, a group of noble dissidents are being named as being high priority to the United States. When you don't do that, that speaks volumes as well. So that Religious Freedom Act also has prisoners lists by country, which I think has been long overlooked. Some of the dissidents in the political sphere get good mention by the Department of Human Rights, Labor and Human Rights, which is good. But again, it often stops there. So we need this whole of government approach so that everyone, and that would go for members of Congress as well, that when we travel, we don't go to China and fail to bring up, particularly if you meet with a leader, the names, and the more specific, the better. I'll never forget, Frank Wolf and I met with Li Peng back in the 1990s. And our delegation, he and I and our staff, were merged with a trade delegation. Thankfully, we got the seats closest to Li Peng, Premier. And we raised the issues specifically of names, Tiananmen Square names, went through religious freedom, forced abortion. We laid out a human rights case. He sat there almost bewildered, who let these two guys in? But the whole discussion was about that. The next day, he met with another group from America, and he launched into a tirade about democracy and how they protect democracy. And he was all on defensive mode because they have much to be ashamed of. These are willful actions taken. What they did to Leo Xiaobo, what they continue to do to his wife, is by design, not by default. And so we need to hold them to account. And my hope is that this new administration will do a whole of government approach. And lastly, I learned a lesson from Wei Jingsheng when he was briefly led out of prison to procure Olympics 2000 for China. They eventually got it in 2008, but they wanted it in 2000. A high-value political prisoner, father of the Democracy Wall movement. spent 18 years in prison. He went back in after we met and had dinner together, not right away, but when they didn't get Olympics 2000. He said, everybody in America and in policymaking around the world need to understand that when you kowtow, they beat us more in the prison. It follows right through into the prison cell itself, and those who administer torture and other horrible misdeeds against prisoners. When you are tough, predictable, look them in the eyes and say, we know what you're doing, we know what you've been doing to Liu Xiaobo all these years, and you bring it up every time, they beat us less and they treat us better. And people do get out of prison. They often go on parole, but they're at least home. And so, again, this pivot to human rights in China, that the horrific death sentence of Liu Xiaobo, it is now that Western governments led by the United States need to say, now we are all in the legacy and in the great pioneering work that was done by Liu Xiaobo. So if you'd like to conclude, or Mr. Garrett wants to conclude with any statement, I just yield to my friends at the witness table. And then Garrett.
I'll tell one anecdote to reinforce the point you just made. My wife is Chinese, and she was a protester in the 1989 events and was sent to a labor camp for 3 years. And she had also studied law, and she looked up the law, and it says in the law of the labor camps that you can labor only 8 hours a day, and they were having to labor 14 hours a day. So she said, no, I'm only going to do 8 hours a day. And so the prison authorities organized a group of other prisoners to beat her, and they did. And this was terrible. She suffered beatings. She snuck out a note via another prisoner who was leaving to her mother. Her mother told Human Rights Watch in New York. Human Rights Watch publicized her case, and immediately the beating stopped, and she only had to work 8 hours a day.
I'll end with an anecdote that is a tragic anecdote, but a reason, I think, for further motivation for us to proceed full force on all of these issues, which is that over the years I've been in touch with many human rights lawyers in China and worked with many of them as well. And obviously I can't provide any names here publicly, but there have been a number of human rights lawyers I know that have been vigorously interrogated by Chinese authorities, beaten, and treated very badly, some of whom, of course, have been sent to prison, others not. But unfortunately, Liu Xiaobo's name has been invoked by the torturers in torturing individual people in China in recent years. And this is when they're trying to persuade a human rights lawyer who maybe hasn't been as aggressive yet as somebody like a Gao Zhisheng, where they are, as they're beating them, they say, this is pointless. You're never going to succeed standing up to the one-party system. And, you know, look at the case of Liu Xiaobo, the world's only imprisoned Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and we're holding his wife with impunity, right? The world knows who he is and can't do anything about it. What hope do you have of standing up to our government? You should just give up right now, right? And this is the refrain that the torturers use as they torture people, or certain people, in China. And to me, this is both unsurprising and equally horrific at the same time. But this only reaffirms why we need to do everything humanly possible to keep Liu Xiaobo's memory alive, and to stand in solidarity with the prisoners of conscience whose names Yang Zhenli was mentioning earlier, as well as the countless hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of others we don't really even know that are suffering. We can't let the anonymous prisoner of conscience be forgotten in China, because they will do whatever they would like to them. And I think that the case of Liu Xiaobo will also be remembered, I think in the best sense, for being hopefully a line in the sand where the international community is able to say to China, enough, enough. We are mutually interdependent, as I think Congressman Garrett was saying, on trade, on intellectual property, on North Korea, Iran, all the things we have to work on. And China can't afford to walk away from its relationship with the United States because it gets angry with the United States for raising human rights. It isn't going to happen under any circumstance. And they're not going to dump our $1 trillion plus of treasuries either, because they're smart and they do not want to lose a lot of money. So they're forced to deal with us on human rights, and why the international community has engaged in so much self-censorship, to me, boggles my mind. I also agree, I just want to conclude by noting what Chairman Smith was saying about these human rights dialogues. I've always joked that, based on friends of mine who have been in them on the U.S. side, and I've heard stories about how they go, that these actually aren't human rights dialogues, they're really human rights sequential monologues. And maybe the Congress could force the administration to call them that, right? We're no longer going to have dialogues with human rights dialogues with China. We're going to require them to be publicly labeled human rights sequential monologues if we're going to keep doing them, because it's not like either side is giving anything, and the Chinese side especially is just giving speeches that are prepared and aren't able to do anything at all. So I also, as well, want to conclude by thanking particularly Chairman Smith. I'm obviously also grateful for Mr. Garrett, but particularly Chairman Smith, for your commitment over decades on China human rights. You have just been indefatigable, relentless, and are such an extraordinary champion here in the Congress on China rights issues, along with Leader Pelosi and others. But the fact that this subcommittee is so focused on China and so focused on human rights more broadly, I don't know what we would do without you, Mr. Chairman, being here and your leadership. And so it's always a pleasure to appear before you, and thank you for everything you're doing as well.
Thank you. You know, you keep saying stuff that makes me want to say more stuff. So I apologize. It's so frustrating, so earlier I believe the IRGC was mentioned in the context of Iran and some of what 4 Americans currently being held by that regime, which obviously as soon as they released a certain subset of Americans found some more Americans to hold. And it strikes me that the regime is undergird, obviously, and we're talking about Iran, not China now, but we're on the same subject, which is global human rights, and by the perpetuation of the IRGC and specifically the Quds Force thereof. Any group of people willing to shoot their brothers and sisters in the face in the street is a difficult obstacle to overcome when you choose to exercise peaceful means of protest for expanded human rights. But what you said that sort of struck a vein was that the Chinese are not going to turn their backs and walk away from us because they're frustrated that we've discussed human rights. So too, I would argue that if you remove the money that supports the IRGC, which supports the Quds subset thereof, and arguably Hezbollah globally, that you will see a climate wherein things like the Green Revolution are more likely to be successful. And so I will take this opportunity to chide the nameless masses who are more concerned with losing money by virtue of the termination of trade relationships with entities like the IRGC, or in some instances even China, than they are with people who have done more to perpetuate human rights and individual dignity and honor than they ever will. That if we stood up with a unified voice and said to the world, you can do business with the United States of America or the IRGC, for example, that the world would choose to do business with the United States of America, and millions of good Iranian people who yearn to have self-determination and freedom and wish to exercise rights towards their brothers and sisters could be the leaders therein. So keep doing what you're doing. I think the reason there's no more hue and cry, candidly, is because folks like Chris Smith, who've been at this for years, folks like Frank Wolf, who's somebody I genuinely admire, were unable to get the message to a broad enough subset. But there's nothing in Washington, D.C. that I can find that transcends political partisanship, like the concept that every human being is entitled to a basic level of dignity and self-determination. And I think we can do things, I really do, but I think we need to make hard choices and say, you know what, this revenue today, this money today, this business opportunity today will be there tomorrow, but right now we need to say no because there are greater things at stake. So I thank you all for what you do. It's an honor to sit here next to you. And hopefully we can get more people aware of circumstances like these, because I think without ever dropping a bomb or firing a gun, we can bring change that frees human beings who have an inherent God-given, in my opinion, right to self-determination and freedom. Thank you immensely, and look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you, Chairman Smith.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Garrett, for your very eloquent summation and your questioning. Let me just, if I could, ask you all to join me in a moment of prayerful silence for Liu Xiaobo. The hearing is adjourned.